Is the Second Amendment akin to mutually assured destruction? Is it noble to not want children? And does DEI improve workplaces? Britt and I tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through social media and we find the most interesting takes one way or the other, and we break down what's good and bad about them. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder, liking and sharing is caring. So make sure to like and share this with your friends if you're enjoying it. Follow us on social media at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, we'll get into the takes. The first one comes from Vivek Ramaswamy, who tweets, "During the Cold War, the US and USSR were both armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. It was mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction prevented us from going to war with each other. Our founding fathers guaranteed the same with the Second Amendment between the government and the governed." What do you make of this Second Amendment defense?
Oh, it's great. It's very crafty too, like for him to put it in the same ballpark of like us against the USSR / what people would think of as Russia today, because it kind of like, I don't know, it equates the two and helps people think about it in a different way. I don't know necessarily how many will persuade, but it's pretty crafty. And of course, he's right about the Second Amendment. And, a lot of people that they're very like, well, you need an F-15 to fight the government. Like, how silly of you to think that if you have just a rifle or a pistol or something like that, that you'll be able to take on the whole United States government. But the people that say that are people that have no experience using firearms and have no experience in any sort of combat against another person or any experience thinking through what it would mean to be in combat against another person. And the fact of the matter is that in any sort of combat scenario and insurgency, if you have a lot of people with guns, it's very, very hard. Even if it's just like an AK-47 that's been dipped in the mud, like in Afghanistan, wielded by a goat herder who barely knows how to use it, bullets give you no chance or give you no second chances. So you have to be perfect in your execution about how you take out those targets. And that's why it's been so hard for the United States in Afghanistan. It was hard for us in the Vietnam War, because when you have insurgencies, even if they don't have the best of equipment, the fact that they are armed with some level of lethal weapons makes it really difficult to run any sort of operation or to operate in an area. And it makes the cost of doing any action so much higher that anytime the calculus is made to do an action, obviously that has to be factored in, and it makes it so that it's just like, it disincentivizes bad behaviors. And I mean, we saw this and we brought it up before during COVID, the only reason that, the unvaccinated were not put into camps like they were in Australia here in the United States is because we have the most guns out of anywhere in the world here in the United States. And in Australia, they confiscated them all decades ago. And so when that type of deterrent exists, suddenly the government has to think about what they actually do, because there could be, if push came to shove, a response that would end in disaster. And that means that we all have to live a little bit more peaceably. I had someone ask me, and Donnie, you came over to hang out for the UFC fight a few weeks ago. One of my friends that came, who's not a big fan of UFC or Donald Trump or anything, he texted me a picture of Trump. He's like, hey, like, this image really disturbed me when I saw it, at the fight. And can you just kind of explain to me like the culture behind the UFC and why people like it and stuff? And I was like, well, one of the reasons I gave him a lot of reasons. And I also joked, I was like, yeah, I don't like Trump at that much, like I don't like, Obama or any other bloodied monster at any of our sports games. But one of the things that's beautiful about the UFC and why sportsmanship is so awesome after it's done and it creates so much peace is because anytime you're in a violent altercation with another person, maybe it's simulated, like you're sparring at a gym or something like that, you can't help but respect the other person, because you realize, one, that they are equally trying to hurt you and they are equally capable of violence as you are, perhaps more so. And then two, you realize that it's much better to live in peace than it is to be violent. So most of the time, like at my gym, a lot of people will get a little bit grumpy at each other during the drills or stuff like that. Or sometimes two friends come in and they get a little bit angry during drilling or some other stuff. And then they spar, and you can't help but be friends after that, because it's like, hey, it's like, whatever our petty differences were before, it's better for us to work those out with words and in peace than for us to actually work it out and have it come to some sort of violent altercation that is not controlled. And that's the beauty about people being armed and being capable, is that it forces everyone to get along and have peace, because the alternative is much less desirable.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. The funny thing about people who sort of disregard his general argument about mutually assured destruction, and like, you need this, somehow you need an equivalent of things for it to, be for guns to operate as a defense, right? Like, you have to have the exact. It's like, have they ever studied history and seen even in outright warfare, like things like the Vietnam War, they did not have equal armaments than the U.S. government, and yet, through clever use of what they had, they were able to hold off an invading force, basically. And same thing with Native Americans in many ways against, British soldiers and things like that. So people just kind of think in this binary, like, in order to fight, one kind of force, you have to have the exact same thing on the other side. It's just a pure numbers game, and nothing else matters. And I think that's silly. But the other thing that I would argue is that with this take, he almost gives a little bit of again, so almost sort of that you have to have the same thing on both sides type argument, in a sense, when the other thing that you can think is, even if your argument was, okay, but if the government really wanted to blow up all of its citizens, it could do that. You could say, okay, that is technically true. Like, if the US wanted to nuke the citizens, sure, it could do that. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say that wasn't totally unfeasible to its own strength and power and financial interests and things like that, which clearly would be. But let's, for the sake of argument, pretend that they all had their power secured, even if they nuked their own country. Even if it wasn't a 100% guarantee against that kind of thing, there's so many lesser forms of oppression and lesser forms of defense that guns provide, even if it's not in equal measure to what the government has. So, like you said, with the COVID restrictions, for as authoritarian as the COVID regime was, and I will always claim that it was so much of an abridgment of our rights because of things like guns, we weren't totally clamped down on. It wasn't like it wasn't a Chinese crackdown from day one. And if it had been, we would have been able to resist it because of that. In smaller measures, there are other things that the government isn't going to try to do as openly. There are cases of like government people trying to hire people for arson in order to take land that they want from a business owner or things like that. But they have to do that in a surreptitious, sneaky way. They can't just kind of go in and say, hey, you're going to give us this building and you're going to like it, because they know there is this sort of, defense mechanism that people have that guns assure in a major way. So even if it wasn't like the most extreme scenario of, oh, you'll never defend yourself against a full government takeover or whatever, there's still a lot of lesser cases that it's useful to have guns for, to prevent smaller tyrannies, more decentralized tyrannies of local governments, of state governments, or of individual bad actors. If you don't view the whole government as bad actors using government power. All these smaller cases are sort of dissuaded by the use of guns, even if you didn't believe in sort of the power of guns to disincentivize a larger movement. And this is also true when people talk about things like banning all guns to prevent mass shootings. They'll say things like, oh, well, if you just get rid of all the guns, then you won't even have murders to worry about defending against. Assuming, again, for the sake of argument, that they're totally right. And if you just outlaw guns, then no mass shooters are going to get their hands on guns, which is a weird assumption to begin with, but let's assume it. You aren't accounting for all of the crimes under murder, which guns deter every day. Burglaries, robberies, rapes, other kinds of assaults. There are all kinds of things that aren't in the shooting category that guns deter against, that are so powerful that you don't even know about because they never happen. They don't make the headlines because they're deterred. So it's just one of those things where people often are ignoring the sort of the unseen consequences of some realities. Like, when you are armed, people aren't going to pick on you as much. And because they're not picking on you, you don't even think about it. You don't even consider that. But having an armed citizenry makes it so that petty crimes, petty theft, in the long run, is way lower. And in the long run, that kind of crime being lower helps create a more prosperous, peaceful society. And I'm not a big fan of a lot of the sort of law and order crackdown policies that governments have. But there is a pretty notable response when you see a government go from sort of ignoring property crimes as the sole, security defense force that's considered legitimate. If they kind of ignore those things and say, oh, people can do what they want and don't respect individual sovereign property rights, you can see the deterioration spreads quickly and it ruins the quality of life for everyone. And the moment you start cleaning that up and show that, private property is to be respected, you actually end up benefiting everyone, in particular the less fortunate who have fewer things and less wealth. They're protected more in this kind of thing. So all of that to say that even as I like Vivek's comparison here, I think it even almost plays up the importance of guns to a level that it doesn't even need to in order to justify. I think it does. I think he's right. But even if you don't buy his argument, there's so many lower benefits in terms of scale that having an armed citizenry provides. All right, so we'll move on to our next one here. And this one comes as shared by Anti-Capitalist, and it reads, the irony of accusing socialists of wanting, quote, free stuff is that capitalism lives on free stuff, labor, nature, the work of social reproduction. Capital exists because something is unpaid. If capital ever paid a worker the whole value of their work, it would cease to exist. Okay. What do you make of this like philosophy 101 students take?
It's pretty bad. It's kind of like they chose to like read. I mean, like on our last episode, we talked about how they will reshape language to suit their own needs. Yeah. This person's doing that here, specifically with free and with value. When they say if capital ever paid a worker the whole value of their work, I wonder how they come to the calculus of what the value of their work actually is. And I think what they mean within this context is the value of their work is the entirety of what someone is willing to pay for it. But that's really not, any person that's ever taken any economics class or even had to run a lemonade stand would know that value is not just like in total what someone needs to pay for. In the context of what this person is saying, like the value of their labor is really actually the component that they contribute to the final sale of the product, right? So if this person is making a widget, like just because they were the last person to touch that widget before it went to the store line doesn't mean that the entire value of that widget that someone pays $10 for can all be assigned to them. I remember when I was like, I think I was like 12 or 13, and at my church youth group, we had like a Halloween harvest festival thing. And at 12 or 13, I was assigned as a job to help out at the youth group to like run around and basically make sure that everyone had everything they needed for like candy and the booth game stalls and all these different things. And my worldview was so narrow at that time, as a kid's normally is. I thought, wow, this entire thing wouldn't work if I wasn't here. Like, I remember thinking that, like, man, how would the booths get candy and stuff? I had totally no thought about like, oh, well, like the church pastor rented out the entire barn. Someone coordinated how to get all the games there. Not only did someone coordinate the games to get there, but someone built the games and someone maintains the barn and all this stuff. And that's like the same worldview that this person has, that like, oh, because I only experienced my role in the production of this widget, that means that I own the entire value of it. But it's like, no, even if you go towards just like the more normie theory of value that people hold, like, it's like, no, like there are still people before and after you that have contributed to the entire production of that. It's not just the making of the widget, it's the sourcing of the materials, it's the management of the labor that builds it, and it's also the store space allocated to sell it, and then the management and the staff needed to sell it. There's tons of stuff on each end that are contributing to the value of that. So yeah, if you paid a worker that does one aspect of making that widget the entire value that everyone else went to work for, suddenly that person would not have a job anymore because no one else would be able to produce anything at all. So this person really just doesn't have a grasp on what value means. And in the best case, it's just kind of a narrow view of, the value is what I contribute to it. It's like, yeah, that's your value to the product, but that's not the total value of the product itself.
Yeah, and let's also look at what he's claiming free stuff is. So he talks about labor, nature, the work of social reproduction. I don't know if he means literally like reproduction, like people having babies, I don't know why.
I think he means like when like a family produces a lot of capital that they can hand down to descendants.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, I mean, like, but let's look at labor in nature then, just in order, so I'm not misrepresenting his arguments and the other. But when we talk about like free quote unquote labor is a cost. It's just not a monetary one if you yourself are putting in that labor or you're paying someone else for that labor. There's no world in which you're getting free labor unless you're involved in slavery, which most capitalists would agree is coercive and not part of a capitalist ideology, and not proper in general. So free labor, you if you're giving someone unpaid labor, they have to agree to it and be thinking that the value they are getting is worth it. So like an unpaid internship, for instance, might be worth not getting dollar amounts because you are getting an intangible good of experience, of your foot in the door with connections with the right people, whatever it is. That's not free labor. When you're talking about nature, let's say, for instance, someone's complaining about a guy selling berries, like he's doing a berry stand because he went and picked all the berries from the forest. Oh, those berries were free to you. No, they weren't. Now, assuming that the land was, not owned and they were wild berries growing, he still had to go and collect that resource. He still had to go and pick the berries from the thorns. He still had to aggregate them. He still had to figure out a price point that people it is worth for them to give him that money instead of going and getting more berries themselves. He had to find the berry location. There's a lot of things that aren't free in that. If it was just free, then no one would buy the berries from him because it was just free to
just there.
Yeah. It's just there. Exactly. There would be no reason for it. And if you're talking about a limited resource, let's also talk about that, because acquiring a limited resource usually also requires some procurement and some work. And if you're talking about, well, that's not fair, maybe this person was closer to the resource that he was able to collect relatively easily and it's finite. Yeah, that is true, that it's unfair. But inequality exists in nature. Inequality exists in every step of reality. And that's not a good enough reason to say that you shouldn't harbor these things and you shouldn't take advantage of them and create an exchange value mechanism. There's very little, if any, examples I can think where there is a finite resource that is just non-competable in terms of there's no alternatives to it. One person has all of the access and they got it without doing any work on their own part, and it didn't cost them anything. For any, if there's sort of two of the three, usually what ends up happening is like, okay, there might be a finite resource of something, and maybe it's very difficult to compete with, but the people who are in charge of that, who own that, had to put in a lot of risk, had to put in a lot of effort, and have to put in a lot of continued work to make it a resource that people can use and buy in exchange. So I just don't think that the idea of free stuff in the way that this person posits it, I just don't think that it exists. I think he's made up a fantasy in his head as though, doing work to get things that were grown naturally or whatever the case may be, like somehow that's not labor, that's not work, that doesn't cost. It's just a fantasy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There is no such thing as free. Because even in your berry example or anything, like someone had to go pick the berry, like effort and labor and resource and time have been allocated to produce whatever it is, even if it seems like the most simple thing. So there is no such thing as a free thing. There's only given or taken or bought, I suppose. And that's like what capitalism suggests. And it, going back to the point that I was trying to address with, like people seeing a narrow view of their contribution to the labor and value. Like I used to, this is a little bit better example than my my Harvest Festival example at 13. This is more real world, but like I used to work at an HVAC firm, and we had technicians, and they were the primary customer facing generation of value. So they would go out to a building, the customers were there, the building managers, and they'd say, hey, we have this problem, can you fix it? The labor would go and fix it. They'd sometimes use parts, sometimes they use their expertise. They were paid very, very well. And they were the primary product, I guess you could say, we were selling, is their expertise to the customer to make good outcomes happen. And we had at one point a few technicians that would grumble because you want to have like a ratio of office workers to people that are out in the field. And the technicians would grumble and say, oh, what are these office workers good for? We don't need them. We should be able to do it on our own. Like we should, in a sense, a distilled version of what this guy was saying. Like we should be able to own our own labor, all of it. The company's getting paid $150 an hour, and we're only taking home 60 of that. And so these guys went out and struck out on their own for a little bit, and quickly they realized that the amount of work they could actually do where they were actually providing value to people was quickly eaten up by all of the administrative tasks, all of the selling, all of the actual dispatch and coordination, ordering parts, making sure that vans were maintained, making sure that tools were maintained. All of that stuff took up a lot of time. And suddenly, even though they were making all 100% of their labor, the amount of labor that they were actually able to be compensated for, which is the actual value of them providing expertise to the customer, the amount of time they were able to spend on that was so small that they were making much less money than when they actually worked for the shop. And that's the beauty of a capitalized business, is that everyone has their specialized functions, and that makes it so that the people who are providing the direct value are able to solely focus on that and provide as much of it as possible so that everyone can benefit from it. When you start thinking in this siloed way and, I can do it all and I should own all of it, suddenly you're actually making less. Specialization leads to more. Siloing usually leads to less, unless you're some super awesome, wonderkind who can do everything. In general, it's best to work on a team with folks.
Yeah, that's exactly. And I mean, you even, if you've ever, maybe this is an unfair assumption for me to make. I would assume this person has probably never run a small business or been part of a small organization. But when you think about that, it just kind of naturally makes sense if you've ever had to work in a place where you have to set up your own HR and you have to do all the things where it's oh man, doing this on my own, there are costs to that. And so when you can outsource that in some affordable way, whether that's hiring someone to take care of that for you as an employee or hiring a firm to handle all that specializes in that, and that's all they do, then you realize, oh yeah, even when I'm not part of a massive company organization, the free exchange with other humans, whether that's structure in as a company employer-employee relationship or outsourcing to another company and doing company-to-company relationship, that's what makes things possible. It's what makes things affordable. It's what makes more accessible to humans in general. When people can specialize and take care of things individually, and you all bring your pieces together, that's when things succeed. So yeah, you can be an important part of that. You can add value, but you also have to recognize that, you at the Harvest Festival or the workers repairing the HVAC, you're not in a silo. You're not all of the value, and your specific piece is only as valuable as it is when it's in concert with other people, generally speaking.
Yes.
If you're an individual contractor and you individually manage everything you do, then maybe that's a different case. But in that case, you're probably not an employee anyway. And so, the value you're providing is set on your terms. So anyway, it's one of those things where, yeah, people act as though because what they're doing, because a particular job function they are serving is a component of a broader company that is vital in many cases, they view that vital thing in and of itself is worth the totality of what it's provided. But if you break off, it's if you break off someone's arm, that arm in and of itself is not as valuable as when it's connected to the body. It doesn't provide you the same value. You need everything that a company offers. You need all the pieces working together in order for the individual component that might be a valuable component to retain that same value. It's not like if you broke off, the sales wing from a company and say the sales wing brings in 80% of the revenue. That doesn't mean the sales wing by itself, without every other component, is worth 80% of that annual revenue in a year. That's not how it works. By itself, it doesn't divide that way.
Yeah.
Human interactions and free exchange is a lot more of a living thing than people recognize.
Yes.
Okay, our next take comes on the heels of Disney and LucasArts announcing announcing who the new is it going to be director of the new Star Wars film? Yeah, the new director of the upcoming Star Wars. Is it going to be the whole trilogy or just the film?
I think it's just for Rey.
Okay, so yeah, some movie featuring the protagonists, kind of sort of the last sequel trilogy, and she is infamous for having said things like she wanted her artwork to make men uncomfortable, and said specifically about Star Wars that it was time for a woman to reshape the galaxy or something like that. And of course, this is rustling a lot of jimmies of people across the internet. And so in response to people being kind of upset about this, this person tweets, just because Star Wars might have been designed for boys doesn't mean it's just for boys. It doesn't negate the fact that 40% of the fans are female, and many of whom have resonated with the franchise since Leia, who's a strong female character that many vibe with to this day. All right, what do you make of this? What do you make of the whole situation?
So this point is like right, I suppose. It's a good point, but it's not. I'm assuming it's in support of this new director's philosophy of like, we're going to make Star Wars that makes boys uncomfortable, and somehow that's going to be pro-woman. And I just I don't believe, and I don't think that in order to be pro-woman, you have to make men uncomfortable, and to be pro-men, you have to make women uncomfortable. I think the original Star Wars trilogy is like proof of that in a lot of ways, and that's why so many people resonate with it. Like, this person's absolutely right. Like, it was designed for boys in that it's like a great adventure, and it has action, and it's set in space with technology, and it has male protagonists, and there are a couple female protagonists and stuff. But like, the overall arc of the story, the overall telling of it is a classic hero's journey, which is accessible to anyone and is relatable both to men and to women. And Leia is an actual character. Like, she feels like a fleshed out, real person that's not trying to make a point. Like, all art, if art is trying to make a point, and it starts with that, with that as the end in mind, instead of it being, we're just going to try and tell a story, we're going to build these characters and set them loose in this universe, it's propaganda. And what this lady is advocating for, at best, is propaganda of, I have a worldview. I don't care that there's an established universe with an arc and an actual set of characters that have certain motivations. I want to impose my philosophy, my propaganda to reshape that. And yeah, it's going to make men, who are the primary customer of this. Like, I'm sure 40% of the women that went to go see, the 40% number that this person says that went to go see Star Wars, went and saw it with their significant other, who was a man, most likely. And they happened to enjoy it, which was awesome, right? That's great. That's fantastic. But if you really look at it, the people that are the primary customer, the primary demographic for Star Wars, a space-centered fantasy opera thing, it's going to be boys and men. And so even from a business perspective, like, this makes no sense. And as you and I were talking about before the show, like, it's just so sad to see the corpse of Star Wars be dragged out and paraded around like this. Like, this really like awesome, timeless like story of heroism and virtue and goodness versus evil is being co-opted for people that think they need to make a point other than the point that was already made. It's like, we're okay with that story of good versus evil being told again and again and again. That's why most movies tell that story, and we all really like them. If you try to stray from that and try and insert your own like weird perverted sense of what everything is, and I would even say it's just an evil sense to make someone uncomfortable for the sake of being uncomfortable, then yeah, you're going to lose money, you're going to lose credibility, no one's going to watch it, and no one's going to like it. Even the women that you say that you're making it for are going to not like it, even though some might say they liked it. But they didn't like it because it was good art. They liked it because they thought you were making a point that scored points for their own team, not because it was awesome.
Yeah, what you were touching on at the end there is kind of where I was thinking of going with this, which is I've long said in many different ways the need of media, whether it's video games, whether it's movies, whether it's books, the idea that like every media needs to be every other kind of media has always made me feel a weird way. Like, for instance, we have to have a realistic looking Pokemon movie. And I mean, like, the Detective Pikachu movie just rubs me the wrong way. I'm like, these creatures look creepy. It does not imagine, like, I don't want to see this. And oftentimes people would respond to me when I would say that I didn't like it. They'd be like, well, how do you think Pokemon would look in the real world? I'm like, well, I don't care, because I don't need to see a realistic interpretation. Like, not every media needs to be in every other media. And I think that this is also a broader symptom of people thinking all things need to be for all people, which is also not true. Like, it's okay if Star Wars is primarily centered for boys. It as this person's pointing out, it may have originally been designed that way. It didn't end up taking off that way. And that's a testament to how good the story was and how good the writing was, regardless of that intent.
Yeah.
So that's great. But it's okay for it to be targeted towards that demographic that it really did take off with. I think to some degree, she also probably pulled that number a little bit out of her butt. I don't know where you get this idea that it's 40%. I actually probably think it's more skewed towards men, because Star Wars fan base is massive, so there are a lot of women who enjoy it. But I think that especially the hardcore fans really are tilted in the direction of men. They tend to obsess over things in general anyway. So I don't know, 40% seems like an exaggeration, but even if it's true, that's beside the point. You want good stories, and Star Wars was not written about how do we design this for boys. It was the idea of like, how do we make a good story of adventure, right? And that will draw in a demographic of boys. That will draw them in as, as people who appreciate that kind of thing. Absolutely. But it's not like, oh, it's time for boys to have a story here and we don't want girls to be a part of it. It was, how can we make a good story? So even if you want to expand things like, okay, Star Wars was originally live action, let's try it in cartoon. Sometimes that can work, but you don't need to force it in every direction. So if your thought there is, well, originally it was for boys, let's see about making a story for girls. You can take certain angles and say, let's explore this universe in this direction, that direction. That's fine. I don't think you need it for every single one. And I think what's the most important is that this isn't just a matter of genres. Even though I already have a problem with everything being in every genre, I think that this is a lot more heinous because, like you said, it is evil. This isn't a, if this was in a vacuum, maybe it would be seen as no, this is just trying to get a unique story spin-off from what people would expect a woman's interpretation from the galaxy would be. But we know that in the modern context, we know from the context of this director in the past, it's not about being good to women. It's about being bad to men. That's what it's about. And that's where it's evil. When you're doing these things to be divisive, when they're done in a harmful manner, that's when it's actually evil. And so it's not even beyond, it's beyond the idea that not all things need to be for all people. It's into the realm of not only do not all things need to be for all people, the way you're doing this is actively antagonistic and should be rejected outright on a moral level.
Yeah. And like, the thing that makes these characters, what makes Leia such a great character is like that she is very distinct from the two other male protagonists in the series, and that she is a woman and very feminine in it. Like, what's so funny about these directors that want to make a point, about making a movie for women is that they just say, we're going to just only have women in it, and we're going to make the women have masculine qualities within it. And it's like, well, that's not actually being like awesome to women in a lot of ways. Like to say we're going to make a woman's movie and fill it with women, but we're going to make them all very masculine. Like that does not actually like enhance the view or the virtues and the unique abilities that women bring to the table. And like, you can't tell a story by eliminating the like, and I guess this is where it kind of goes. Like there is a distinct difference between men and women. Like in order to like determine the shape of a character and their outline and who they are, what they like, don't like, and what motivates them and what doesn't motivate them, what makes them angry or what makes them sad. Like you have to take into the fact their gender and their sex. Like that's a huge aspect of it. And when you do away with that and say we're all just blobs, like suddenly everything also becomes not only just like wrong and like not a good story, but it also becomes bland and boring because differences are what make things interesting. The conflict and the motivations are what drive characters to do certain actions that make us admire them and respect them. And when you take that away, suddenly it's like, oh, well, we can predict what they're going to do, and not in a way that's like, oh, that's so Leia. That's like, oh, that's so that director's viewpoint. And that's so sad because good stories are supposed to make us almost feel like these characters are real. And it's because they are real of just timeless truth. Like they are memes and they are analogies that we see play out in our daily lives. And when they get kind of destroyed like that, it's really sad. And I think that's why there is so much animus around Star Wars. There was so much animus around Luke Skywalker being treated the way he was in The Last Jedi, is because like, wow, there was a hero that had a wonderful arc that was able to overcome the sins of his father and redeem his father. And then suddenly, like, you totally just destroyed his character. And it was like, this is not Luke Skywalker. It's like watching something that is a stranger. And that's why people were so upset about it. And it looks like, I mean, wasn't a particularly big fan of Rey or basically any of the sequel characters at all. Maybe Kylo Ren a little bit was good, but other than that, they were all pretty bland and boring. And so for them to make a movie about one of the more boring protagonists of recent memory, and then have this director, I guess it serves it properly. It's a bummer, but it is what it is, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly right. I think you summed it up nicely there. All right, our next take comes from We Are Child Free. 2 images. The first saying, "I just can't," when they're both in sort of quotes. "I just cannot see myself become responsible enough to take care of a human life form, and without children, I am able to do whatever I want, whenever I want." All right, what do you make of this?
This is an absolutely terrible take. Parenting and having, I'm not even parenting yet. My kid, she is 15 weeks old. She's still tiny. Parenting is like creating and guiding a human into like their personality. In this stage of life, like I'm more just protecting. Like I'm making sure that this little human has enough to eat and that they don't scratch their eyes out because they don't know what to do with their hands, and that they sleep and all this good stuff. And it's very hard, right? Like my daughter does not sleep on her own. Last night I got 3 hours of sleep because I have to have her sleep on me in order for her to sleep at all, in order for my wife to sleep. And so my wife and I take turns, and it usually means that we share about 6 hours of sleep between the two of us that we can split, where we actually get some shut eye. So it's very hard, and it's been that way for 15 weeks. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding. And it's rewarding in that it has called me into additional selfless virtue. And what this person is saying, they're justifying, like, put aside what they're talking about, which is having a kid or anything like that. Put that aside. They are justifying not doing something because they relish in not having certain types of virtues. Like the virtue that this person is saying they don't want is they don't want to become responsible enough to take care of another human life form. They don't want to be selfless. They don't want to think about anything other than themselves. They only want to do whatever they want, whenever they want. Literally, that's what they say. That's how they justify not making a certain decision. And they're like happy to be within that type of lack of virtue within their life. That'd be like the equivalent of someone that is, overweight and needs to get healthy, being like, oh yeah, like I'm proud of not running because I don't have the willpower to go on a run. It's like, you should aspire to be, even if you can't run a mile, even if it's like not your goal to be a marathon runner, maybe it's not even your goal to run a mile. You should at least aspire to have enough physical fitness and healthiness to run a mile, because that is indicative of who you are as a person and your discipline. But these people have no shame in admitting that they are selfish, that they only want to do what they want to do, that they don't care about other humans, that they only look inside themselves. And I think it's not only is it a bad take, I think it's a despicable and selfish one at that. And it's sad at the same time, because this person is going to wake up one day and realize, maybe they won't realize, it'll be even sadder then, that they've lived their life only for things that are temporary and that are not real, that fade away, and that are not, that have no lasting value or happiness or joy in their life. And it's going to be a sad moment because they won't be able to get that back by the time that they realize it'll be too late.
I think that these images are very deceptive in that the tag on the side and the name of the account says "We Are Child Free." And yet both images describe the absolute essence of what a child is, of being a child.
Wow, that's good, Donnie.
I just cannot see myself become responsible. It's not even that I'm not responsible enough. It's I can't see myself become responsible enough to take a human life form.
Yeah.
And then without children, I'm able to do whatever I want whenever I want. Like you said, these are not virtues. And listen, I can hear the instant rebuttal being like, oh, so you really want these like people who aren't going to be able to take care of a baby to have children and them to grow up in an unstable? No, I don't want that. And if this is the case, if someone is genuinely too immature to take care of a human, then yeah, I don't want them to have a kid, but I don't want it celebrated. I don't want this posted out like it's the best thing in the world. It's the exact same thing. Like, look, like I don't love running. I don't like running, to use your example. I think it's awful. I still strive to do it. It's not my favorite thing.
Or at least you could if you had to. right? Like you're
And
physically
absolutely.
able to go from point A to point B.
Right. I physically can't. And I'm never going to say, like, I'm never going to brag, like, huh, I hate running. And, like, it's a good thing. Like, when I say, like, man, running's the worst, I'm not saying it as a thing, like, this is a positive thing about me. It's just me being, like, lamenting, like, oh, man, this is hard. In the same way that you might lament getting 3 hours of sleep is rough. Like, that part isn't, like, an enjoyable thing, but that doesn't mean that you give up and you celebrate, like, man, sleeping in like 12 hours is so worth it. It's like, no, don't celebrate the vice and or and say like the virtue. The reason we don't want the virtue is because the vice is so good. Like no, even if you find yourself in that state, even if you find yourself where you actually genuinely feel that you can't be responsible enough to take care of a human, I don't want that celebrated, because what that does is that creates the cultural expectation of, yeah, this is a good thing, this is a normal thing, and that drives more people to eschew things like discipline, eschew things like responsibility. That's not a cultural value you want to celebrate. Even in the individual instance that it might literally be true that someone is too immature, you shouldn't celebrate that. You shouldn't say that, well, that's who they are and therefore it's a good thing,
Yeah.
because that incentivizes and drives people to more. In the same way that, like, there are things there are unhealthy behaviors. Like, for instance, someone who's so far gone into smoking cigarettes and they're an addict, and they would say something like, I just can't see myself become non-dependent enough to stop smoking and to quit. I'm too addicted. I don't think there's ever a point at which I could do this without physically dying. Like, that might be true for some people who are so addicted that it would kill them to quit. That doesn't mean you celebrate that addictive behavior. That doesn't mean you say, well, that's just who they are. You know what? It's okay that he's still a smoker. You still say, you know what? That might be true, but that's not something to brag about. That's not a good thing. And so these posts are just trying to say these vices that we hold on to are worth celebrating, and we should become filled more with this. That's what it's trying to do.
Yes.
Because people feel bad that they don't want to better themselves and then try to justify it instead of acknowledging we're all flawed, we all have weaknesses, we have all things we can work on. Instead of going that route, you just say, no, I'm this way, but it's okay because it's a good thing. And that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. It's like justifying a pathological liar because their brain is wired and saying, well, lying's actually okay for them. Like,
lying's
no.
okay for me.
Yeah, lying's still bad, and lying should be disregarded. That doesn't mean that someone who's a pathological liar is always gonna be free from that. And I get that, and that's true. And you help people in that case, but also you have to recognize that in the first place, that it's a deficiency, that it's a disability, and saying like, I can't see myself become responsible enough to take human form, that's a deficiency. That is. Yeah. And I hope that someone who says that starts to try to work on themselves, because maybe they'll never get to the point. Maybe they won't get to the point where they could take care of a human form, but they sure as heck can become a lot more responsible than being someone who celebrates the fact that they'll never become responsible enough for a kid.
Exactly. They should aspire to be capable enough, whether or not they do it or not. I mean, and I have opinions that they should, but they should aspire to be the type of human that could take care of another human life form, as they put it. And it's what's kind of like, I admire the honesty in some ways, because prior to this child-free delusion land we're in, like, people would say things like, oh, well, I just don't want to have kids because society's just kind of going in the dumps, and I don't want to contribute to climate change, and there are already too many humans. It's like, really all behind that was just this selfishness, and this like, oh, I just want to be able to do whatever I want whenever I want, as this person literally says. And it used to be that they would try to, like, the child-free folks would try to say, like, oh no, it's not that we're selfish, we're actually more selfless than parents because we're not having kids. And so in a way, I admire these people because at least they're being honest. They're saying, yeah, we're selfish humans that don't want to have, anything to do with the betterment of anyone else. We don't want to have any selfless thoughts in our brains. We want to do whatever we want whenever we want, and fulfill all of our whims at any time. And that's that. And it's like, okay, at least you're honest. At least I know what kind of person I'm dealing with. Like, this is not a good person. This is not even a person that you would want to be friends with, because they obviously don't care about anything other than themselves. So I admire that honesty of it. And I kind of wish in some ways that the climate change save the human world people excuse for not having kids would just admit this, but both are bad.
Yeah, absolutely. This makes me mad because it's trying to flip the script. The reasons why I would say, for instance, you should have kids is so that you become a more responsible, sacrificial, good human in terms of why you should have kids for your own benefit, right? Like there should be an external benefit. But if you're talking about what are the benefits for yourself, I mean, you should talk about like being a more generous, selfless person is a goal worth of in and of itself. And they're saying,
Yes.
oh, well, no, I'm not going to do that because of the opposite of that thing that you just said. It's like we're just talking on completely different levels, and it's wild.
Yeah.
Okay. Our last take here is an exchange between Mark Cuban and Elon Musk. So Elon Musk starts the exchange responding to Ed. Is it Krasen or something like that? I think he's a journalist. Yeah, Krasenstein. That's right. And Elon responds to him talking about DEI stuff, which he says discrimination on the basis of race, which DEI does, is literally the definition of racism. And Mark Cuban quote retweets this and goes out on an exchange here. He says, "Let me help you out and give you my thoughts on DEI. Number one, diversity. Good businesses look where others don't. To find the employees that will put your business in the best possible position to succeed. You may not agree, but I take it as a given that there are people of various races, ethnicities, orientation, etc., that are regularly excluded from hiring consideration. By extending our hiring search to include them, we can find people that are more qualified. The loss of DEI-phobic companies is my gain. 1A. We live in a country with very diverse demographics. In this era, where trust of businesses can be hard to come by, people tend to connect more easily to people who are like them. Having a workforce that is diverse and representative of your stakeholders is good for business." And this isn't really part of the take, but I had to include it because it was Elon Musk's reply that was genuinely very funny. He then says, "Cool. So when should we expect to see short, white/Asian women on the Mavs?" Because, of course, Mark Cuban is the owner of the Mavericks. All right. Take it away.
Yeah. So I actually I'm critiquing Mark's post. Like how he describes diversity in this way is not everything before the 1A is not actually that bad to me. When if you're looking to hire good people, like looking in weird places in populations that may have been overlooked to find like the diamond in the rough, that other people, because regardless of what people will say, like people being employed is a resource. So being able to find that is like a really huge advantage. And so when you can get good people and you don't have to compete with other folks because they've overlooked it, like that's true. The problem is that DEI, as it is commonly actually executed in the United States and by companies, they actually are incentivizing it in recruiters by having quota-based systems. And it's not just like some like fringe theory or something like that. Like this is actual, like in Reuters and the New York Times, like these companies have gone out and said, yeah, our recruiters, part of the way we measure whether they are hitting their goals or not is whether they hired X amount of Black people, X amount of Asian people, X amount of whatever type of people that they've got on their quota. And so it's not actually about finding the best qualified person. If it was about finding the best qualified person, then yeah, this is fine. Like look in under investigated populations to find the best quality person, because there could be a chance that you would find someone that's awesome. Like I knew someone that found a genius software developer that was working in a warehouse by investigating like these really low level coding like competitions. And this person had been overlooked by everyone, but because this recruiter was able to look into, it was able to take a magnifying glass on something that other people hadn't looked at, they found this diamond in the rough. That's awesome. But that is not the basis of what DEI is in the United States. And not only now is it like the companies that are enforcing that and they're saying quotas. And when you incentivize recruiters and people that are responsible for getting labor into the workforce with saying you got to hit these metrics, it is going to result in less qualified people being hired simply because they are of a certain type of race, which is discrimination. Because to hire someone is also to not hire someone else. On top of that, we now have like with ESG and everything, people that provide capital and funding to companies, startups, all this different stuff. If your ESG score it has diversity within it and it's low, like you cannot get capital. So there really is like a systemic push to enforce these types of quotas at the expense of hiring the best people. And it's all based on like the color of your skin. And yeah, just because it's based on the color of skin of people that were oppressed within the last 50, 100, 200 years, in this country, and not at the expense of, and at the expense of people that were not, or that were, man, I'm tumbling over my words, that were, oppressed, maybe 500 years ago. That doesn't change that it's racism and bad. I mean, I know that the left's definition of racism is like prejudice plus power, but like the general definition is like, oh yeah, like you are determining that someone can't work here simply because of the color of their skin, an immutable characteristic, and that is evil and wrong, regardless of the way they try and spin it.
Yeah, it's as we were kind of alluding to earlier, it's this control of the language yet again. It's one of those things where they're trying to say, oh, diversity and equity and inclusion, DEI, has no other context other than the individual components that it makes up or whatever. I would argue equity in most cases is already actually wrong, but the general idea of diversity, the general idea of inclusion are not wrong or bad to go for, right? But we also have to recognize that altogether this is a completely different thing, that it's more than the sum of its parts. So like you're saying, that's how diversity, equity, and inclusion get applied into the workplace is basically just through a racist lens. And if all of what Mark Cuban were saying is true, then the best businesses would be succeeding with those people in that way. And you wouldn't need a DEI department to sort of force this naturally. It's the exact same sort of argument as the idea behind the wage gap for women, where it's like this idea like, oh man, women are paid, I don't remember the stat,
70 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, they always shift it up, but yeah, like 77 cents or 70 cents on the dollar. And it's like, if this was true, do you know how many businesses would be overwhelmingly hiring women in order to save on labor costs if they were doing the exact same work? That's like, maybe men and women specialize in different ways. Maybe men and women have different qualifications in certain areas, yada yada. Don't need to go into the whole wage gap, but it's the exact same thing where people act as though they're like the only reason why these realities are so are the way they are, the hiring practices and stuff. The only reason they're that way is because of this unbelievable, indiscriminate racism that exists. And it's just like, you can't just make these claims about real economic factors that don't bear out in any example of the real world. It makes me think of my college debate days when you would have this, this notion in debate, and people would talk about all these harms, all in the air, and all, hypothetical. And then it's like, but none of it was tied to reality. So you could hype up how, deregulating small businesses would end up hurting queer people of color in sub-Saharan Africa, and these are the important stakeholders, and you could make some long convoluted linked case how this would all affect them. And then when we get to the real world, you realize none of that is true. You're just waxing eloquent. And that's what it feels like with this thing about, Mark Cuban talking about like, oh, well, here's this hypothetical about, if you find people that are in these diverse areas and you hire them, this is what's going to shore it up. It's like, cool. Yeah, that's probably true. And the best businesses will find those people, but that's not the reality we live in. And you're making up this whole case about everyone just being so unbelievably racist and discriminatory that they're going to hire at the expense of their bottom line and their success as a company. And that's just not borne out in the economic data. It's just not borne out in any semblance of reality. And so it's very frustrating for him to lay out this case as though it's completely neutral. And the other thing to me is, it's like, okay, that's also fine if you want to say that these things are going to give your company an advantage, but you also have to recognize that even if these are lofty, attainable, good business practices, you have to admit that the almost religion in which they are, or religious manner in which they are enforced on companies, is weird, right? Like the ESG stuff. Like, if this was just a noble, good business practice, then companies will voluntarily adopt it, and it will happen regardless. And it won't have to be forced on you. You won't have to be shamed. You wouldn't even have to be making this post to try to appeal to the fan base that is going to, lavish your praises. Like, you even doing this is emblematic of the fact that you're trying to virtue signal to people because it's a good PR move, and that's it. There's a weird devotion to it. So if it's a good business practice, then cool. Don't advertise to your enemies why this is a great thing. Just take advantage of it and outperform them. But that's not what's going on. You're doing this because it's a culture of praising this ideology and enacting this racism in a way that makes you socially acceptable. That's what it's about. It's not about any of these economic factors, because anything that's good for business in those ways will get spat on by the same people who are praising you right now anyway, because they don't like big business.
Yeah. And his little last addendum, the 1A point of we live in a diverse country and people and businesses tend to trust people who are more like them or whatever. It's like, yeah, and you would be irritated and call people racist that of one particular skin color that wanted to only associate or have some sort of business with that particular skin color themselves. It seems like it only cuts one way, and that means there's no principle behind it, which means it is racist and wrong and bad. And it reminded me of this friend I had, and he's black and awesome dude, but like hasn't thought through some of the words he says. And we were talking about, I moved out to Snohomish here in Washington, and Snohomish is like 60-40 Republican, like the actual like town and stuff. I'm not Republican, I'm libertarian, but it is also pretty white, as most of Washington state is. And my buddy who's black, he's like, yeah, when I told him we were going to move out to Snohomish, he's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't want to move out there. I was like, well, why would you want to do that? He's like, oh, well, I just want my kids to be able to go to a school with people that look like them. And I thought, man, if I said that, or some white person said that about their kids, like let's say you lived in Baltimore or something, and you're a white couple, and you said, yeah, I send my kids to the private school outside the city limits because I want them to be around people that look like them. Everyone would rightfully so be like, that's disgusting and wrong that you said that. Especially if it's said from the point of like, oh, all black people are bad or something like that. But that's essentially what this guy was saying, and he's a good person and everything. I just don't think he was really thinking through it. And a lot of the stuff has kind of infiltrated his brain and causes it to shut off the aspect of like thinking through his words. But yeah, like it is true that people like to associate with people that are like them. Like think about like software engineers, James Damore at Google. Like James Damore wrote a paper saying, hey, the reason why there are not more women in STEM and in software and stuff like this is because like it's really only allocated, like the interest of it is allocated towards men. And so it's more likely that men are going to be part of it. And men are comfortable, especially the kind that like to code and do all that stuff, are also only comfortable being around other men like that. So that's why we have this. And so if we want to like get more women in, and he's actually kind of like an egalitarian in a lot of ways. Like if you want to get more women in, then you got to make these changes. And people hated him, and he got fired for pointing that out. And it's just like we were talking about with Star Wars. Like there are distinct differences between men and women. And I'm not saying that about races, but I'm saying that like in the workplace, like yes, diversity of thought and opinion can be important, but sometimes it's not important. Like sometimes like diversity of opinion about how to tackle a specific problem is what's most important, and having the best people in the job is what's most important. And for Mark Cuban to be like, oh yeah, like people need to be around people they're comfortable with. It's like, you're right in some ways, but like that cuts both ways, dude. Like you can't say it for one race and not the other and not be a racist yourself.
And when you're bringing up the school example, it made me think of a post I saw from someone who I know tangentially, and this family recently moved to Canada, and this mom was talking about one of her daughters, and her daughter is pretty young. I don't remember exactly how old, probably in the 7-year-old range, something like that. And moving to Canada, they're in a new school, and she was saying, oh yeah, like I think it's really important for her to grow up seeing a lot of people who look different than her, but she's having a really tough time connecting with her classmates because they all don't speak English, and so they kind of all stay with each other because it's an international school. But it's really important for her to be around people who look different than her. And I was just struck by the idea that like the idea to this, the fealty to this idea of DEI is so strong that this mother is willing to sacrifice her daughter's socialization. Her daughter's having a rough time at school, not being able to make friends, because she thinks it's more important for her to be around people who look different than be around people who she can even communicate with. This idea that like diversity of how people look and their race is more important than even being able to experience those differences in a meaningful way through interacting is so toxic, because the idea is the only way that you're going to be able to experience diversity and have a diverse range of experiences with people is through their skin color. It doesn't even matter if you can talk to them because they can't even speak the language you're speaking. It's more important that you physically see someone of a different race than it is discussing ideas with people who think differently than you and who have different perspectives, regardless of their skin color. That to me is so harmful. So it's like, on the one hand, I think that it's ridiculous for a business to say, oh, we're gonna pass up all these great opportunities economically in order to cling to our racism. I think that's ridiculous. But then in the real world, the racism of we're only going to hire based on these things and we're going to sacrifice our bottom dollar to it is kind of the driving factor for a lot of people, a lot of companies. So it is very crazy. It's very wild that we live in this time. But hopefully the pushback, all this sort of resistance we're seeing from people is indicative that the pushback is strong enough to make a difference. And so I'm a little bit optimistic there.
Same.
All right. Well, with that, we will close this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. As a reminder, give us a like, a follow, and share if you're enjoying the work we're doing, and we'll catch you on the next one.